Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this DevToberfest session called Dealing with Legacy Code and Transactional Consistency in RAP. And we have several experts with us today. We have Marcel, we have Renzo, and Volker. Hey guys, what's up? So Marcel, we'll start with you. Can you give us a little bit of info on your background?
Yeah, sure, Rich. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Marcel Hermanns. I'm a member of the ABAP platform team. And yeah, I'm driving RAP forward. And together with Renzo, we design RAP from an architecture point of view. And Volker, as part of the integration team, he's validating everything we do. And yeah, we are in close contact with a lot of developers who contribute to RAP. And of course, many application colleagues on the S/4HANA side.
Cool. And Renzo?
Yeah, hi developers, hi everybody. So my name is Renzo Colle. I'm with SAP since 25 years now this year. And yeah, I'm responsible for the end-to-end programming model in S/4HANA. And as RAP is our target programming model also in S4, I'm also here in the role of the lead architect for the ABAP RESTful application programming model.
And then, of course, we have Volker.
Yeah, hi everybody. Also from my side, my name is Volker Drees. I work for SAP since more than 24 years. Actually started in the consulting department, and yeah, I'm also part of the ABAP platform, as Marcel stated, working in the integration team for the ABAP RESTful application programming model.
Okay, great. So we have a packed hour here, so let's jump right into it, guys.
Oh, perfect. So maybe I will start. So there was a different session, a second session, which is called Developer Extensibility and Business Events with RAP in S/4HANA Cloud. And in the other session, we talked about on-stack extensibility with RAP and also side-by-side extensibility via business events, which are created and exposed via RAP. So it's about how can I, as a customer or partner, extend SAP applications. Now, in this session here, dealing with legacy code and transactional consistency in RAP, we are more talking about how can I reuse and integrate my existing application code in new applications in S/4HANA, public cloud, private cloud, or also in Steampunk. So we have different development options. So you all know Steampunk, the SAP business technology platform ABAP environment, where we are using ABAP Cloud only. In S/4HANA Cloud, the public edition, this is we have the same rules. We apply only ABAP Cloud, but in on-premise and now S/4HANA private cloud, there's also the possibility, like in the past, to use a classic ABAP. Now, what's the difference? ABAP Classic is what we invented, what we are using since many decades. There is no limitation about the feature set you can use. You could use everything which was invented in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And there were many good things. Maybe there were also some inventions which are not so good, or at least not good in a cloud environment. And therefore, it's really important to apply rules for cloud lifecycle stability and to apply these rules also for application development. And one part is, for example, a clear interface and a clear contract between the different parties. So that's what we saw, for example, in the other session, that we have a clear interface for the sales order, the sales order to P business object. And yeah, with ABAP Classic, this is different. Here we have the interfaces. We have upgrade stable and cloud-ready programming model, which is there in the ABAP Cloud. And now we come to the question, for all these four cases, how can I now integrate my existing application code for these different development options? So of course, the very important question at the beginning is, where should I start? So if I'm now a customer or partner and I have tons of coding, many lines of code, how could I start now? Many of you know probably already the custom code migration, which we support from the ABAP platform side, where you can apply a SAP node, and then you will get some ATC errors in your system, which show you which parts of your coding are maybe not cloud ready. But this is, of course, a very technical stuff. So this helps the custom code migration, of course, from a technical perspective, but we also need some kind of strategy. So it doesn't make sense to have a lot of ATC findings and to work on them step by step without having a clear picture in mind how to move forward. And of course, this is very specific for each customer and for each situation where to start. But of course, the three things which are now the drivers are the relevance of the application. So which application am I really interested in to bringing it into the cloud? So which is important. But maybe it's not always the easiest thing to start with the most relevant part if it's also the most complex part, because sometimes it's really helpful to start with something which is simple, still relevant, but simple, and not to choose an application which covers all aspects which are required, and to argue if this can be migrated or can be integrated, then everything can be integrated, because the most complex application will probably fail if you start with that one. And maybe effort here is also very important, and to start with a relevant, not too complex application, which might also not be the biggest one. So, but in general, of course, it's hard to give some guidance here, but with these three keywords, I think you can maybe think about a strategy. So, but what does it now mean from a theoretical point of view? How can I now integrate existing application code into REP, and why should I do that? And how do I then really start from a technical level? So there are three different scenarios which we always point out. So either you start from the scratch building new applications, then of course the question of how to integrate existing application code is not so important. But the second use case is what am I doing if the code is not reusable or it is reusable? So what does it mean? So if I start from the scratch, then I always use a managed REP business object. If I have non-reusable application code, so for example, because I have DynPro application and my coding is tightly coupled with the PBO, PAI exits, and I cannot really decouple it, or it's hard to do that because I have many dependencies to DynPro, then I probably still use a managed BO, because also here REP can take over many tasks, but I have exits where I can plug in stuff which I still want to read. So for example, enqueue logs, authorization objects, the database tables, and even the data which is contained in the tables in the productive systems. And for example, also a common pattern to have an update task function module for persisting the data. And these reusable fragments I can still use in a managed REP BO by applying the unmanaged log and also the unmanaged save. We will see later what that means. But if I have some reusable application code, so imagine the sales order where we have an ABAP object-oriented class wrapper around the functionality, which offers create, update, delete functionality, then these APIs can of course also be integrated into some other protocol, not only in the DynPro PBO PAI exits. And the reason why some applications have these reusable APIs is normally, or in most cases, because they also integrated not only into DynPro, but maybe also in some other technologies, for example, SOAP. And here also the smart application colleagues separated the APIs, the real business logic, from the specific protocol. And of course, also here, enqueue logs, authorization objects, database tables, and update task function modules are used. And now, what is really important to understand is that even if I now change my system, so for example, in a running on-premise system, I do some refactoring or I do some enrichments, I can still create my managed or my unmanaged REP BO and exchange the coding later on, or change it for new scenarios, but still it works also in combination with the logs, with the authorizations, and with the same database tables and the same content in the database tables. Because also for us, from SAP perspective, it's a must-have that the old applications and the new applications can also work in parallel with the same data and with the same users. So, but what are now the managed BOs or the unmanaged BO in detail? So the managed REP BO, for example, if you start from the scratch, or if you completely want to renovate your code because you think it's quite old, the colleagues who invented it are not there anymore, you really want to start from the scratch, then this is also the scenario, your choice of the scenario. And here we can see the visualization of the different scenarios. Here we have a REP BO, and we from REP side take over in the managed case the default CRUD, create, read, update, delete implementation. And this behavior can be influenced via determinations and validations, and of course via actions. And these are then implemented in the individual business object. And then this business object can be used in multiple scenarios. So this is what we want to depict here. So we can expose it as OData services. We can call it maybe via EML, Open SQL-like, ABAP SQL-like language, and ABAP native language to access APIs which are created via REP BOs. Of course, for OData services and APIs, the layer for projections and interfaces is missing here, but we want to focus here on the business object itself. So, of course, the managed BO also have a default save implementation, so you don't have to take care for buffering any changes in the transaction buffer or to write the changes later to the database. This is all done by REP, the REP runtime. Then the second scenario, where you can maybe reuse your existing function module for the update task. Still, the default CRUD implementation is taken over by REP, or can be taken over by REP, and the logic can be fine-tuned via determinations and validations, but still the save implementation of the update task function module can be called within the REP BO. So we don't use the REP default implementation, but we use then the exit of the application to save the data. And in the unmanaged REP BO, it's even more, not only the save, but the complete create, read, update, delete, and execute action logic is then taken over by the application developer. And REP is more or less just a facade around the existing coding. And this facade, this standardized API, helps us to integrate this into the different protocols so that the application developer does not have to understand all the details about OData protocol or event protocol or other protocols maybe in the future. So, but why? That was a question, how can I do that? And now the question, why should I do that? So all the different business objects, they have all the same qualities and the same feature set. It's not really important how a BO is implemented. It's just important that we have the BO and all the benefits which come then on top. So as I mentioned several times now, the protocol level integration, for example, into OData, but also having the EML as the standard ABAP native supported language for accessing REP BOs as in API use cases. If you are using REP and the newest features, you're always cloud ready. So this is for ABAP Cloud very important. We have clear contracts, and we have the REP transaction model, which will be explained later by Renzo, which makes sure that in the cloud everything goes right. And of course, as we saw in the other session, we have many extensibility options which come with REP. So some of them are only applicable for managed BOs, but many of them are also applicable for the unmanaged BO. For example, adding an action and bring this to the Fiori end user UI. We have business events for all these BOs, which can be added very easily. And what we are currently working on is to enable reuse objects and reuse services and bring them together, because with the ABAP Cloud, we combine now the different technologies which are very important. So we have CDS and we have REP as the core, but we also integrate here further technologies like reuse objects and business events, maybe also as a good example. Integrate that into REP to have a full-fledged programming model covering all the different aspects. This is called ABAP Cloud. But now, how can I start with my implementation? So maybe we start with the easiest part, with the read-only scenario. If I come now from my ABAP Classic, for my Dympro application, I have a database table. Probably I don't have yet CDS views. If I have them, I can, of course, reuse them. But I do have usually a Dympro application. That's at least what most of our customers are using in the on-premise world. And now if I want to adopt this and create an application in ABAP Cloud with REP, then what we need is the database table to be consistent to ABAP Cloud, which means it has to follow the ABAP Cloud rules, which can be checked via the custom code migration ATC checks. And for example, I need to consider which data elements and which domains are released from the ABAP platform, which can be used. And maybe this slightly needs to be adapted when I adopt it for ABAP Cloud. And of course, the basis in ABAP Cloud, also the basis for REP, are always CDS views. So I can add them, or if they are available, I can bring them from ABAP Classic also to ABAP Cloud, which means to change the language version from ABAP language version space to ABAP language version 5. Or from classic ABAP to ABAP for cloud development. And I typically create then a service definition, service binding on top, which takes some seconds. And with ERM, I have also to do something on top, and then basically the read-only scenario works. So here, not much of my coding is reused, but this is only the read-only scenario, where we then from website translate the URI request, for example, from OData to the backend, to the database, and translate this to SQL. So, and how do I start now with a managed rep scenario? So of course, I start first with the read-only scenario. And then if I go ahead with the editing scenario, I simply add the operations create, update, delete, and everything works. And I also can very easily add the draft functionality via the so-called draft actions, which is also not a lot of work, because here we take over the default implementation and do not or cannot integrate the legacy code, because we start from the scratch. And as I said earlier, we can enrich this behavior. And now the app supports draft and active data. That means usual process relevant data in parallel. So all the logic is applied for both. And this is then running in ABAP Cloud. And what we support here, we invented a so-called rep generator. So it's in the menu of your ADT. If you do a right click on a database table, then you will see a generator for the artifacts which are required. And just some hint, if you plan to create a Fiori application, then I would recommend to use the draft as early as possible to always double check if it works for the draft scenario in the UI, or also for the non-draft scenario, which is then of course also relevant for web APIs or the EML use case. That was a managed scenario where we don't really integrate existing application code, but just to mention it for the completion, for the complete overview. Now, what about the managed scenario where I want to reuse my update task function module? So if I'm now, and now it's a little bit, we need to differentiate between the SAP BTP, Steampunk, and SAP S/4HANA Cloud, Public Cloud Edition, and the private cloud and on-premise use case. So if I'm with Steampunk or the public S4 Public Cloud, then what I need to do with my update task function module is to bring this into the ABAP Cloud. And this works only with the custom code migration, where I need to resolve the ATC findings. One finding, for example, could be that the update task itself is not supported in ABAP Cloud because there's no need for that. Maybe Renzo can give us some insights about that later. So, but once I reworked on the update task function module, I still have my completely managed business object where just the save is overwritten via my own logic and not the default implementation. And therefore, the editing scenario with draft works out of the box. And also for active data, I simply need to add and enrich it via determinations and validations and actions later on, like we did with managed VO. And then at the end, this app works perfectly in all the scenarios and runs perfectly in ABAP Cloud. If I'm now, and maybe this will be released soon in the next days, not in a public cloud or Steampunk environment, but I'm running on-premise with the newest release 2022, or in the private cloud edition, then we have even one option more. Because as I pointed out at the beginning, we have ABAP Cloud, but also the classic ABAP programming style there. And since we have both, we could use a more stepwise modernization. In the first scenario over here, so in BTP and public cloud, we just have ABAP Cloud, and therefore we need to do the migration before we import the coding, or after we imported the coding with syntax errors and the application is not running in the meantime. But since we have now both in the private cloud and then on-premise, we can do a stepwise approach, and the code can run always, and we just do a refactoring, a stepwise refactoring then internal. And how can we apply that? So we still have our update task function module, which could now even have the update task because it's the classic ABAP. And what we can create is what we also do in the ABAP platform or in S/4HANA is to create a wrapper around that, which is then C1 released for ABAP cloud development. And since this is now released, I could call this in ABAP cloud and call my update task function module implicitly. But the rest of my application, all the other coding, is still part of ABAP Cloud. The complete OData service is built in ABAP Cloud. It has just a dependency to a released wrapper API around my old logic. But here, this has this opportunity, the benefit that I can run my application very fast, and I don't need to rework the complete function module in a first shot to get it running. I can have a running version without doing bigger refactorings here. And then I can go ahead and stepwise fight my ATC findings and bring this update task function module from classic ABAP to the ABAP cloud, which is of course the target if you want to be cloud ready. But this modernization we can apply in a stepwise approach. So this is a benefit if we have both ABAP styles in the stack. So, and for the unmanaged scenario, it's very similar, but it's just more coding which we have. So we have maybe the update task function module, but we also have create, update, delete, and maybe some action implementation already there. So in BTP in Steampunk or in our public cloud, we first need to do the custom code migration, either in, for example, an on-premise system, prepare it, or in the target system and do it later on by fighting even syntax errors. And once I did that, I can of course integrate that into RAP, like in classic ABAP. But first I need to bring it into the ABAP cloud. And again, if I'm with a private cloud, with the private cloud edition, or with the on-premise, S1 on-premise, I still have both options. I can again create wrapper APIs around my existing legacy code and call these released APIs within my RAP business object. Of course, it doesn't mean that the complete application is cloud ready. It's not yet cloud ready. It needs to be completely in ABAP cloud, but I integrated that into my first part of a cloud ready application. And I can afterwards, again, stepwise refactor my APIs, my coding in a stepwise approach, and really focus maybe first on the create, then on the update, and afterwards on the delete. And the spaghetti code, maybe the old tightly coupled code in the PBO PAI exits, it's not relevant in the scenario of a managed PO, for example, with unmanaged save, and therefore I don't even need to rework on that. And therefore, it's really important to understand that such a strategy from an architecture point of view, and this is really important and not just fighting ATC findings. So, having said that, maybe Renzo, next question could be, I have now my coding available, I integrate that into RAP, but how can I make sure that this is really cloud ready? And what does it mean for the SAP LOW? So Renzo takes over the control of my screen.
Yeah, so thanks, Marcel. Good, so let's look at the transaction or the SAP LOW. And what is different here? So using, or let's say when you go ABAP Classic to ABAP Cloud, then obviously also the classic programming in ABAP meets the cloud programming model, which is not only maybe SAP GUI and Fiori or something else in this case, but there is also a different, or there can be a difference mainly with regard to the update handling and the database modifications. So the sub transaction and also the database transaction. And as you know, the ABAP world or the ABAP server abstracts from the database completely, database transactions and updates via ASQL. And this also applies to the database transaction as such. So we have the so-called SAP LUW or ABAP LUW logical unit of work. And we have the database transaction. And also this is abstracted, but what you have to keep in mind, or what you probably know as an ABAP developer, that the ABAP transaction or a logical unit of work and the database transaction is not necessarily one-to-one, which means an ABAP transaction could theoretically have multiple database transactions, and even vice versa, there could be multiple ABAP transactions sharing the same database transaction, which is even an exceptional case, but everything is possible technically in the ABAP world. And this you have to take into account, and ideally don't mix up these two things in the classic ABAP, so that you ensure that everything works fine. So to look into the details here, we have here an example, and we need to look at, let's say, the different use cases or scenarios that we have in the transactional world, mainly here. And looking at the ABAP session, we have one scenario. I have to check whether this goes ahead. Not really. Ah, yeah, there it is. Here we have, let's say, something like a one-shot scenario, where you have one request, let's say, coming in from outside, be it via RC, SOAP, OData Web API, could even be a UI in this case, with a one-shot scenario, where you have a quick action or let's say a non-draft Fiori UI even, which processes the changes or hands over in one request all the changes. The ABAP application, the ABAP server is processing that, and at some point in time, when you're done, when you have processed everything, when you have checked everything, then you do your database updates, and usually in the classic ABAP, usually via the update task and update task function modules. And maybe also, if you use a different programming model, also via direct database updates. So at the end, at this point in time, it doesn't matter. So then you have this commit work, which also implies a database commit, and then the data is stored to the database at the end. If it's consistent, otherwise, obviously, you would fail, roll back, and tell the consumer, okay, I could not process this request. The other scenario, going one further, is rather an interactive scenario. So usually a stateful UI that we have. And in Fiori, like Marcel stated, we also handle that similar with the draft handling. But let's say a stateful UI, classic SAP GUI UI. And this is not specific to ABAP, obviously, what we see here, beside the update task probably. You have interaction, so the user enters data one after the other, expects immediately response from the system to show what is the impact of the data changes. So we call it side effects, and determinations, validations running already during the interaction, and that you immediately visualize and see what has been changed. If you enter some data, derive defaults and all that stuff, and obviously. At that point in time, also errors or warnings could appear, and the user could still react. So in this case, we don't have, let's say, a one-shot scenario, but an interactive scenario where you also process the changes, latest when the user wants to save the data, obviously, but probably also in between, to have side effects even during interaction. Then you do a final check, and then in this case, if here you face an error in the data, in the consistency of the overall application, then you don't necessarily roll back everything and say, okay, I cannot do that. But you go back, let's say, to the interaction phase, ask the user or tell the user, okay, there are some errors in. The user can fix the errors and try again, let's say, save again. And this is why in the interaction world, this is a little bit different, obviously, because we, let's say, go between the interaction phase and from the save phase back and so on. This could happen multiple times, obviously. So when the data finally is consistent, or the system says, okay, now you can save, and there are no errors, then again, data is written down to the database directly or via update task with finally a commit work, committing the database transaction, and then the data is saved, and you tell the user in this case, okay, everything is saved, document is stored, created, whatever you have done. So this is more or less the current processing and the transaction in RAP, or in ABAP in general, not in RAP, and probably even in other applications. So as I said, so the most part of that is not even ABAP specific. So now let's come to the specifics, especially in ABAP, and especially then also if we look at the ABAP Cloud. So if you look at this picture to the left, then you see obviously the commit work finalize the transaction, the ABAP transaction, the sub LUW. And if you have multiple commit work, so something in between, so if in your application code, in the process changes part, somebody writes commit work, obviously then there is even a database commit, and usually the transaction is done and a new transaction opens, which obviously disrupts what we see here in this picture. So depending on what you have done before, it might not do any harm because the commit work would just not do anything. Yeah, but nobody can assure this. And this is exactly one of the differences that happens now also in ABAP Cloud. Because if you have done certain SQL database modifications already in this process changes phase or in this final check phase, wherever, and not only in this database update phase that we see here on the time flow, then obviously a commit work or even a database commit, which could happen also implicitly via different means like a wait statement or an external call, RC function, whatever you call it. This all issues database commits, and then this data, if it's written in this early phase, is already saved to the database. And if you register an update task function, which is more or less the second option to write down to the database, if you already registered that in the early phase, here, in this case, also commit work would then start this update task function. And obviously it's far too early, and then you write already data, but the user probably might change the data again and again. So it doesn't fit together. In the update task function, and on the other hand, and this is why update task is in the classic ABAP exactly the, let's say, recommended approach for the programming model in the applications. If you do database commits and you have registered update task functions early, in the classic ABAP or in this picture here, it doesn't do any harm because the database commit is not the commit work in ABAP. So it just commits the database transaction. But if you have not written any changes to the database, obviously it would not write anything, and it also does not do any harm in this case. So this is more or less the issues that we see here. If you have too early database updates or even call function and update tasks, this would break if you don't know what you're doing. And now in the other world or in the S/4HANA world, where we have business applications, you usually don't know what happens. Yeah, and especially with the extensibility features, and Marcel mentioned those, where you can add extensions all over, be it in classic ABAP via modifications or via bodies that are everywhere in the code, or even with the RAP extensibility at the end. Then in this case, you can never be sure that somebody has written data already in a body very early, and you do a DB commit via an RC function or something like that, and then the data is written. Or if you do a commit work in the body, which would disrupt your transaction if you have done too early changes to the database. So that's clear that in a world where a lot of things come together into one ABAP transaction, SAP logical unit of work, that you don't have the control over everything. Yeah, if you have a very small application, you might have, but not in the world where you call other applications, where you offer extensibility features all over, and you mix up the different, let's say, business objects that are all part of one big transaction, because we have a lot of dependencies and business logic, obviously. So these are a couple of issues mentioned here. And now how do we deal with that with RAP, or what is the implication here, the answer to that, let's say. So, and in RAP, if you look at the logical unit of work and the RAP transaction model, in RAP we have defined a clear transaction model from the infrastructure of different phases, where we have this interaction phase, which is the phase where the changes are processed, and in RAP managed is implemented via determinations validations. In RAP unmanaged, usually you call any bunch of legacy code in the big modify implementation. And then we have a final check, and in this case, run into the early and late save phase. So you run into the save sequence if somebody states, okay, now I'm done, I want to save the data. Then the save sequence starts, and there is an early phase where we do final checks and final modifications. Obviously, it's not only checking, but also probably final changes to ensure overall consistency. And if everything is done, then we move into the late save phase. And in the late save phase, finally, you do your database updates in the classic ABAP with update task in the ABAP cloud directly to the database. And this is more or less also the main difference between a classic ABAP and an ABAP cloud in this case, because in ABAP cloud, usually you don't use the update task anymore because it has not really a meaning. Yeah, so it's asynchronous processing. Yes, we'll come to that in a second. But the pure database updates, which should be done in there, usually in the classic ABAP as a guideline, or even here it's much more superior to directly write down to the database instead of moving into the update task. But this has exactly this impact to the transaction and to the programming model, that in this case, you have to be sure that such database modifications are not done in these early phases. So here, RAP speaking, in the interaction phase or in the early save phase of the save sequence. Because if you do so, there might be database commits, which we cannot prevent. So it's not only you in your applications, but as I said, extensions, other applications that could do that because of whatever they do there, remote communication synchronously or something like that. To ensure that here these are not, this does not get inconsistent, we have to ensure that such database modifications do not happen in this early phase and in the interaction phase. On the other hand, in the late phase, now where we don't use the update task anymore, but we directly write to the database, in this case, here we need to ensure that no database commits. Beside the commit work of the ABAP LUW, no database commits happen in between. And this is why here in this phase, database commits are forbidden. And now, thanks Marcel for switching. In the RAP transaction model, now we have these different phases. And with RAP, now we also manifest these rules and these guidelines. And it's more than guidelines. It's really basic rules of programming in RAP and in ABAP in general, by the way, that these rules are followed by raising the violations if database modifications are done too early in the early phases, and if database commits happen due to whatever statements in this late save phase. So this is what the transaction model checks and ensures, and this is integrated completely in the ABAP server. And if you have something like a, I think, strict 2 behavior definition in ABAP Cloud, then here you will immediately get a dump for that, so that you cannot do it wrong in this new, let's say, implementation. And if you have this, let's say, rather integrated model where you have a legacy wrapper and you use the legacy code and need to, let's say, adapt that, you probably only get here some kind of a logging or something where you can ensure that you follow these rules and, let's say, see these violations if you don't find them because you produce inconsistencies or something. So this is more or less the model. What you see here in between, transactional buffer, I think I missed that one in general, even on the previous slide. So in the, let's say, process changes phase, you usually do all the changes in the transactional buffers, in your ETABs, in the main memory of the ABAP server. And in the update task, you just hand over this data and put it down to the database. So this is here more or less in RAP not different. So here we have this transactional buffer at the end as let's say the main information of changes between the interaction phase and moving into the state phase. Now what about now remote communication, asynchronous processing? So I talked about the update task, and that the guideline obviously is that in the update task, you usually should only do the database updates. So all the processing, all the logic already happened, and you hand over the changes to the update task, and in the update task, you just put them down to your database tables, more or less one-to-one. This is the ideal world. And this is why in the cloud programming model, or in general, and now with the modern, let's say, databases, so modern, yeah, since years even, and also with HANA in this world. Here, obviously, this doesn't make sense anymore to write the data into something and then take it out again and move it to the real database tables. So obviously, this is why the update task is not there anymore in the modern, let's say, ABAP programming in ABAP Cloud. And this is why we also need an answer, because what we maybe could see is that this update task, which is classically running asynchronously, is partially also misused, yeah, because there is partially a lot of logic in, and it's partially misused for some asynchronous processing. And for that, obviously, the right approach is something else. So usually in the classic ABAP, it would be the BGRC. And this is why I move now ahead. So there are use cases, obviously, for asynchronous post-processing. But the answer is not the update task. Yeah, it's, as I said, in classic ABAP, the BGRC as one example or one technology. Because what you need to ensure, and now here is one of the scenarios where you need asynchronous processing, is regarding remote scenarios. So if you have some kind of remote communication and you have, let's say, a secondary transaction somewhere else, you obviously want to keep consistency between these two, or in this picture, even three different transactions, where every transaction ends with a, let's say, final database commit. Doesn't need to be ABAP, obviously, on the right side. And here, if you now would do this communication in the early phase, let's say, then you would have committed probably the changes on the right track, maybe both. Yeah, but the ABAP transaction on the left side would probably fail because the user cancels finally and you never reach the commit work. So you have some inconsistency by definition that probably cannot even be cleaned up properly. So you have to turn it around. So usually the pattern is that you finalize the ABAP transaction with a commit work, and then you start remote communication or asynchronous processing, in this case via asynchronous processing, to ensure the ABAP side, or let's say the source, the sender side is final, is committed. And with the commit, you also register or store the registering of these, let's say, asynchronous post-processing. And in this case, you would it is ensured in this case. You obviously need some infrastructure that ensures that this post-processing is also done in a reliable way. And the BGRC, obviously, as an example, is like that. So, or the formerly known QRC in this case, where you post-process that stuff, and if it's done, if everything is successful, then it's okay. And obviously, you have some eventual consistency between these two sides until this is processed. So this you have to take care in any case. But the infrastructure ensures that this is really also processed. Yeah, and if it fails, then you see this, you see the queue, and you can restart that, or it's automatically restarted to ensure this is really also persisted at some point in time and committed, so that you reach consistency at least at some point in time. So examples here for, let's say, asynchronous processing in these remote scenarios would be something like email sending. So business events is a good example now to the event mesh. We also saw that if you attended the session this afternoon, or calling, let's say, other remote services, whatever. This is one example where we need asynchronous post-processing to ensure that remote scenarios are handled consistently. But obviously, we also have local scenarios where asynchronous processing makes sense. Probably exactly this misuse of the update task in some cases where you want to improve the performance of the main transaction and do things that are not that important. And secondary, let's say from the consumer point of view, you just move them out into secondary processing. So example here are change documents. Maybe if you don't want to see them immediately, or it's okay that these are written asynchronously, or some local events to raise whatever workflows or other things. Yeah. So here, by definition, if you have a switch of the persona, a different user, then obviously it's asynchronous by definition. So when to register now such asynchronous processing. So from what we have seen, and also the picture obviously implies that it should be done and may only be done in this final late save phase. So just to be sure, because it's like writing something to the database, so registering this additional function. So it has to be in this phase, and in the RAP managed, this would be usually the additional save or even the unmanaged save if you mix it up with your own persisted data. But recommendation is obviously also always the additional save in this case, or in RAP unmanaged, the complete save method. This is where you usually do that. And yeah, what comes next? I mentioned the BGRC as one technology that is available since years in the ABAP platform, also classic ABAP, that is or would be the infrastructure tool of choice in this case. And here we also, or the ABAP platform will provide here probably in future also something like BGRMC, which is maybe a project name. Not sure whether this will be the final name here. So it's just a lab preview. And in this case, this would be, let's say, a kind of improved version of the BGRC that is cloud enabled and where you don't have, let's say, for the simple use cases, not that much of a configuration and so on. So it's just built-in qualities like we usually have that in also in the standard RAP programming model. So that's more or less from my side. Handing back to Marcel.
So yeah, thank you, Renzo, for giving us some insights. In order to wrap it up, we are talking about bringing existing application code into one of our deployment options. And we saw how RAP supports that from the beginning with managed and unmanaged, or the intermediate step was managed with unmanaged save, where you can integrate your coding. So that's one thing. We also saw that with the private S/4HANA private cloud, and with on-premise, we have additional options with a stepwise approach, because we can combine the old and the new, the cloud world in a stepwise approach, and do not everything in one shot. And as we are talking here about business applications, the most important stuff of business application is the correctness of data. So what happens if the data in a system is wrong? What happens if the workflow is triggered, even if the change was not really persisted by the end user? All that is really important and covered by the SAP LOW, but having a driver license to understand the SAP LOW doesn't make traffic lights obsolete. We also need traffic lights in the cloud. We need to understand how that all fits together and put that into a framework, into rules, and that the rules are applied somehow. And with RAP, and the transaction model of RAP, which we introduced directly from the beginning with RAP, this transaction model is exactly the pattern of the SAP LOW, and therefore it's important that we can now check all the restrictions which we should have in the SAP LOW, that we can check that within the RAP runtime, because we know where we are. In the classic ABAP, if we implement any application, there is no clear phase or no clear model, transaction model, and we cannot check this. But now with RAP, we have a clear model, a clear transaction model, and we can, for example, check that only one commit work, which we own from RAP side, is performed, because we don't know how many players are in the game. We can ensure that the SQL updates are done at the very end and not somewhere in between, and other things like that. So, and with the BGMC, that's now the future local lab preview, we can also see how we can in future, it's not available, this technology of course yet, how we can in future put post-processing into asynchronous calls, improving the performance, bringing us more into the cloud world, where we can apply our scalable architecture in the ABAP platform, and cover also the different asynchronous qualities of monitoring and exactly once in order. And so we have something which is already there, something which is on the way with the transactional consistency, and something which will come in the future. So having said that, I think we are through. Thank you, Renzo. Thank you, Volker, for being our back office and discussing with the chat. So do we have any questions from the chat, Volker, which we should discuss here?
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. Yeah, there are actually a few questions. I try to follow up with the chat in parallel and trying to pull out certain documentation links. So yeah, nevertheless, there I think are a few leftovers. Let me quickly check what is the most prominent one. So there's one question regarding IAM, the abbreviation that stands for Identity and Access Management. I think this is a quick one that was mentioned on one of the slides, but I think we didn't dig into detail about it. And then what is regarding the, I think the one in the read-only RAP more or less service, the query where, just read out the question for read-only RAP queries, where you want to create documents based on a display row, calling a BAPI/service and an action would violate the transactional model, right? What's the compliance solution?
Yeah, yeah, probably I take over. Maybe we can also add here some information that we will also publish a blog post soon, maybe regarding the SAP LUW and RAP with further details, like I have explained here. So it's not that easy, I have to admit. And additional background information. And yes, the understanding is completely wrong. So calling a BAPI in this case is in the, let's say, in the early phases would be wrong, yeah, because a BAPI by definition, BAPI, what did I say? BAPI. A BAPI by definition is, let's say, a one-shot scenario, a one-shot API that includes this complete, let's say, picture here. So from process changes, final checks to the, in this case, update tasks. The BAPIs by definition you have to use update task, and they by definition may never do a commit work. Yeah, so there is a BAPI commit function that you have to call afterwards. Usually BAPIs are for remote access, so it's exactly this, let's say, web API approach. And if you want to integrate a BAPI into RAP, then the only place where you can call it, and this is valid, yeah, that's okay, is in this early, in this late phase, sorry, because it includes an update task. But this means that also all the processing, obviously, which happens inside this body, is also part of this late phase. Yeah, so which means it only works, or there are two preconditions depending on the scenario. So first of all, it only works if there are no other violations, like let's say database commits done by the body, which hopefully is the case, but we never know. Yeah, but usually this should work. And the other thing is, it more or less works the same in this, like in this one-shot scenario, because here, as I said, at the end, if you are compliant, it doesn't really matter where you do the stuff. Yeah, but it will not really work in the interactive scenario. Besides, you want to have really some interactive checking and some side effects and changes already visible to the user. Then obviously you would have to, let's say, re-implement and refactor part of that out, yeah, to ensure, let's say, some basic checks, some basic business logic before you would call this body. Or if you're lucky, you have something like a simulation or check body and a final post body or something like that. In this case, you may just use the one body, BAPI, sorry, in the early phase, and let's say the post BAPI in the late phase. No.
So that means in general, BAPIs were created for exactly this one shot to be called via RFC, and not as an internal ABAP API, which is called during a different SAP LOW, because the BAPI itself, like you said, is an own SAP LOW. Therefore, we must be careful by using that, right? So, and if you're using it, just very late. But I think the question was more to the read, to the query, wasn't it, Volker?
Not sure, to be honest. I just read out the question entirely. So that's at least what was stated here. because the read as such, I mean, if the question was about offering an action, and an action itself means that you already have a RAPO, defining that action and exposing it, so to a certain extent you're already in the transactional world. It's not a read-only anymore. But yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think there are some further questions. I mean, there's one kind of administrative question that rather goes to Rich. I think you can answer it then when closing the session, which is making the slides available. I'm not sure how that is managed. Then there was a question if there are certain tutorials. I guess you mentioned that there will be a blog post that is planned, Marcel, that offers or explains what is basically covered in this session. There is not yet, as far as I know, any tutorials or hands-on sessions planned to cover the kind of the transformation of legacy code into RAP. However, in the RAP reference scenario that we outline in our documentation, we basically simulate a kind of an integration or reuse of legacy code, in the sense that we showcase some function modules for the CRUD operation, create, update, delete operation, and how that is integrated in an unmanaged RAPO. So maybe that could be a reference that is to be found in the official RAP documentation. And then there was also a question about change documents integration. That is also possible. It is released from an API point of view, so you can manually integrate with change documents in the sense that you have an implementation in the additional save or in the unmanaged save of it. However, we plan to offer in the near future even a direct integration into the RAP language, and then it's even easier for you that you can define a change document object and then let the framework write and update the change documents for you.
Exactly, and maybe if I may add something to the rollout material, I think this session here was one of the first rollout activities for this complete picture related to RAP. But of course, there will be additional stuff. So, like Renzo pointed out, there will be a blog published soon. We might also add this later as a link to this YouTube video, which explains then in detail how the SAP LW was designed, what should be covered, and how the RAP transaction model fits to it. Exactly what we discussed here. So there will be a small blog around that, like 5-10 minutes read. And regarding the refactoring, how can I now renovate my application in Steampunk? How can I bring it to the cloud, make it cloud ready and implement it via ABAP Cloud, and have this stepwise approach? This is something, to be honest, this is something where we need to think further, because CDS and RAP is not everything. There are, of course, also other development artifacts, other ABAP objects which need to be covered. And here, I think it's our task from the ABAP Cloud, from the ABAP platform, to come up with some kind of refactoring guide or something like that, which can be offered. I don't know in which format, but which can be offered so that our customers and partners with embedded Steampunk, and especially then also with private cloud and on-premise can apply that. But of course, embedded Steampunk and all these refactoring on the private cloud and on-premise is something where we just started. So it might feel a little bit shaky for this release, which will be available soon, probably. But of course, this is something we really focus on because we see such a high potential and a clear strategy, a clear path for our customers, how to come into the cloud with a stepwise approach. And I think that's a unique opportunity which you have here. Volker, any other questions?
I think we are mainly through. There was one regarding simultaneous calls. I'm not sure whether I entirely understand it, but I will just read it out again. For simultaneous calls, do database deadlocks have to be prevented manually using some enqueuing?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that again. So yes, the answer is yes. So the programming model in that sense does not change. So the main processing is done on the ABAP side. And if you want to ensure that concurrent changes within the session, obviously, do not happen, you have to use still the classical enqueue. Yeah, so the database log is just an addition, but this is usually not used in the ABAP programming because it only applies, let's say, if you would have a different kind of processing where you would log, let's say, the database early. So something like a select for update or something like that. But this is not the intended programming model. In the classic ABAP, you could do something like that, but in RAP, this is not intended.
Thank you, Renzo. And then I think last one on the list is RAP unit testing ? I think that I assume that refers to general unit testing. And there, I think, yeah, we offer again in the official RAP documentation a so-called test guide, RAP test guide, that covers I would say the main aspect of the testing, included unit testing, which is testing the RAP implementation on the various levels. So ABAP unit for the implicit or for the explicit implementation of the individual methods, like any kind of an action or determination or something like that. Even scenario tests in the sense of EML calls, so that you validate your VO for a certain scenario, and even integration tests in the sense of that you make use of the local client proxy where you simulate basically OData code. So these 3 levels are covered in the official RAP test guide that is part of the official RAP documentation.
And of course, everything we introduce newly is, we also consider, of course, these aspects. So we, from a project perspective, very close to RAP, we will also in our area develop the BGMC, which is of course RAP independent, but still we will cover all the aspects which we in general cover with RAP, like testability also here. So the BGMC will be in the first, or at least in the second version, also have an easy testability approach. Maybe we need a test double framework or something like that. So let's see how we can ensure that. And we of course apply all the other qualities we have, like documentability, testability, extensibility, and all that stuff should always work also in combination. So just a small remark.
Exactly. Thanks, Marcel, for that addition. Yeah, I think it's important to always underline and highlight the RAP qualities, because we might take them for granted, but I think it's always worth to mention them, because they don't come for free, and they make a lot of sense here, definitely. So with that, I think we are mainly through the questions. I think the remaining part is the slides topic, which Rich might be able to answer.
Yeah, guys, I'm not sure how we're handling the distribution of slides at this point, but I'll look into that today. Maybe it's as simple as adding a link to the actual event page in the core and the groups groups.sap.com. But I'll look into that. Thanks, guys. Really, this was a fantastic session. A lot of great information here. Just like the last session we did today, these topics are going to be, ever more important as our customers and partners move forward with their S/4HANA journey. So again, thank you for joining and sharing your knowledge here. And thanks to everybody watching around the world. Make sure you check out the DevToberfest calendar for other sessions happening this week and over the next few weeks. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.